You can only be as accurate as your layout. So use these tips to measure accurately and put the lines exactly where they're supposed to be. So we'll start out with a pencil. And I'm suggesting that what you use is a fine line pencil. This particular one is a 5H. The very fine point on this makes a very precise, very, very thin line, as opposed to the lines that most woodworkers use with a number 2 pencil. Doesn't sound like a lot, but a number 2 pencil can leave a line that's about a 1/16 of an inch. And by cutting to one side or the other, you can really throw off your ultimate measurement. And of course, there are carpenter pencils, and though they're good for some things, I don't think they're really good for marking in the shop. One caution when you use a very fine, hard pencil, please don't press real hard with it. You can actually scratch the wood and make that line very hard to get rid of. The nice part is the line can generally be sanded away, but also it can be cleaned off by using a little bit of rubbing alcohol. And I've got some denatured alcohol here. And I can just take that line and remove it with a little alcohol. It's a nice, easy trick. It actually works really well. And in some cases, you really don't want to sand that pencil line because it's really close to a profile that you don't want to lose. Rubbing alcohol works really well. Now, there are also times when either sanding or using the alcohol method may not work well if a project that you're planning on trimming or working with or making marks on has a finish on it already. One of the quick techniques for eliminating that potential problem is just using some painter's tape. I've had a little piece of the top of this. This is a stained piece of material, which of course I wouldn't want to use alcohol on because I may dilute some of that stain, and I don't want to write on it because there's no way to sand that off. Putting a piece of tape on here and making whatever marks I need to make or making whatever trims I need to make on there, we'll make them on the tape. And once I'm done making that mark or making that trim, then just removing that tape restores a nice pristine look to the top of this without having complicated that with any pencil marks or alcohol or sanding. This actually works pretty well. Now, a second way to mark a line, instead of using a pencil, is with a marking knife. This is a commercially available one. They're all about the same. They have a beveled edge on one side and a flat side on the other. And the way to use it is to set it up next to a straight edge and mark a line. Now, normally the flat side goes up against the ruler, and you can see right away that I'm kind of at a disadvantage here because I'm left-handed. And this is a marking knife we made in the shop out of a piece of bar stock. Just filing a flat on both sides gives the advantage to both lefties and righties, and the flat side still is something you can index against the ruler. So the idea is we're going to set this up against whatever line we want and literally scratch a line with that marking knife in there. The line is extremely visible. It's very precise, so you can cut exactly to that line. And what I really like about it, especially if you're marking for mortises or tenons, is that line allows the perfect place to put a chisel, and it holds it exactly in that spot without trying to balance it on a line drawn by a pencil. It's a great little tip, works really well. I use it all the time. And as long as I'm holding it, let's talk a little bit about this combination square. I use them all the time, and one of the real reasons I like them is because they have a really nice 12-inch ruler attached to them. The real deeply etched lines here that signify the 1/8 inch and 16th inch and 1/4 inch and 1 inch marks provide a great straight edge. And it's a real consistent straight edge I can use to check my table saw and my miter saw and my bandsaw markings. But I'll also use it to check any other ruler I'm using, like this tape measure. And as long as that tape measure's marks line up with my ruler's marks, I can use both these interchangeably. A 12-foot tape measure is more than enough for the shop use. Anything bigger than that is kind of cumbersome. So now I've got a perfect straight edge, and combining it with a combination square gives me not only a 90-degree square, but I also have a 45 too. It works really well. One of the things that you'll have to check, though, is to make sure that the combination square you're using is actually square. There's a real simple method for doing that. I've locked this in just with an extension of the tongue here large enough for the board I'm going to use. And just take a pencil, make sure that the small edge is on any flat, straight surface, and put a pencil line straight down on the board. If I flip this to the opposite side, and I line up that pencil line, if the pencil line on the opposite side of that square matches what I did on the first side, this square is square. Surprising how some of them aren't? This is a great way to test them. And the last thing with a combination square that I kind of like too is if I'm trying to measure to the exact middle of a board, in this case we have 16 and a little bit less than 1/2 inch. And my math is terrible. I know that it's 8 1/4 plus something. So what I want to do here is put a mark at about a little bit less than 8 1/4. And to make sure that mark is in the center, I can use the combination square by just sliding that edge of the tongue until it matches that mark. Just about here. And then flip it end for end and see whether or not it matches it again. Now I'm off probably a 32nd of an inch. By moving this just that little bit and splitting the difference here, I know that my new marks will be exactly in the center on both sides. They don't call it a combination square for nothing. It's a great tool. These are great techniques for making sure that the mark that you put is exactly where you want them. And maybe I can add one more. Sometimes when you put a straight line in something, it's hard to decide which side of that line you want to be on, or if the line is on a slight angle, you don't know which part you're striking to. So maybe when you put a straight line on something, instead of doing the straight line, put a small V in that spot. The V will tell you at its apex exactly where that line is. So if I want to use my marking knife, I can set my marking knife right at that V, set my square up to match it, and scribe my line. And do the same thing with a pencil. What it does is it puts that line exactly on the apex of that V. I know exactly where that mark's supposed to be. And as long as we're talking about making pencil marks, make sure that you look straight down over the top of the ruler when you make those marks. If you look from the side, you're introducing what's called parallax, and it can kind of set that line just a little bit off your intended mark. So if we put our mark there and looking straight down, we know that the mark is directly where it needs to be. Marking one piece directly from another eliminates the problems of making mistakes when measuring. In this case, we've got a cabinet and we need a couple of drawer fronts for it. I've laid it on its back to make it easier to see. If I take a piece of wood and use the opening I need to create the new opening by marking it, it'll eliminate any chances for measuring errors. So if I want the length of this opening, just take a piece of material like this and lay it up against that opening and measure the length of it by using my marking knife right off the edge of that existing opening. And if I want the width of that same opening, by laying it across the top and putting my marking knife on the side, I can now mark the width. So I have the width and the length of this directly measured off the opening. If I want a 1/16 of an inch reveal around that entire opening, I can take 1/8 of an inch in width and in length off of this, and what I get out of that is a perfectly cut opening that I know is going to work every time in each one of those drawer fronts. It's a great method to keep you from making mistakes.